Thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series, NF University. Our presenter today is Dr. Shalene Jobin, and the topic is Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships. What is the relationship between economic progress in the land now called Canada and the exploitation of Indigenous peoples? And what gifts embedded within Indigenous worldviews speak to miyo pimâtisiwin, the good life? And Shalene, I'll get you to correct me on my presentation on that later. And specifically to good economic relations. Upholding Indigenous economic relationships draws on the knowledge systems of the Nehiyawak, the Plains Cree people, to explain settler colonialism through the lens of economic exploitation. This talk looks at Indigenous knowledges and teachings on Indigenous economic relationships as tools that enable us to reimagine how we can aspire to the good life with all our relations. Dr. Shalene Jobin is an associate professor in the Faculty of Native Studies, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Governance, and Director of the Indigenous Governance and Partnership program at the University of Alberta. Dr. Jobin's most recent publication is the book, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships, Nehiyawak Narratives. She is also involved in the Indigenous Approaches to Governance in the 21st Century and Prairie Indigenous Relationality Network. She co-founded the Wahkohtowin Law and Governance Lodge and is a co-creator and founding academic director of the Indigenous Partnership Development Program. Shalene is Cree from her mother, from the Wuttunee family, and Métis from her father, the Jobin family, and is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in Treaty 6. Shalene's publisher has generously offered a 20% discount to NF University attendees for the upcoming month, and the link to the offer is in the chat. I do hope many of you use this opportunity to get your own copy of this book. Shalene, please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you. Kathy, can you see the screen?
Yeah, it looks fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Tanse, Shalene Jobin Tsigasun, Loretta Wuttunee Nigawi Nehiyawak Otsi Red Pheasant, Fred Jobin Palm Notui Apitogasen Otsi Big Prairie. Hello, everyone. My name is Shalene Jobin, and thank you for NF University for inviting me here today, and for Kathy for the introduction. It's a really big honor. I've just started, my book just came out a couple months ago, and so I've just started doing a few different speaking engagements about it, and so just really honored that people are interested in my work. So this started as a project in 2003, so 20 years ago, and I had a business undergrad, and then I did a master's in Indigenous governance. And coming out of that and starting thinking about that, for one of my final papers in my master's, I was really grappling with the question that to achieve self-determination for Indigenous peoples, that we had to be economically independent from the Canadian state. So that was kind of an argument that's been around for a while. And so I was really curious with my business degree and then my Indigenous governance degree, and then which was kind of like a really focused on decolonization of the mind and kind of, you know, a Frantz Fanon, if anyone's ever read him, but applying it to an Indigenous context. So really these two different viewpoints I had and in schooling. And then I started a PhD in 2009 in political science and Canadian politics and Indigenous studies. And so that was kind of my dissertation was looking at this question. And then coming out of that, I wanted it to be a bit more accessible. So my mom's read every draft, and so just really thinking through that question. And one of the things that I thought through when I was doing this is governance. And governance, we can think of governance of economic relationships. We can think of all the ways that governance happens around us. And one of the teachings that I learned about when talking to different knowledge holders for the book is this concept of ṁ, and that means learning through observation. And about a year ago, around this time, maybe a month earlier, I was looking out of my office at home and seeing these beautiful birds, and there just seemed to be, all of a sudden about 50 of them all swarming around my backyard. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is so beautiful. And previously I had lived on an acreage outside of St. Albert, Alberta. And one day there was a deer that had been killed, and it was on the road in front of my house. And I was looking out the window, and I thought it was so interesting because there was almost like a hierarchy of the different animals that came to eat this deer's meat. And it was the other animals would stand behind as those animals that had first dibs were able to eat the meat. And then once they were done, they left. And then those other animals came in. And wow, I thought, oh, that's so interesting. The governance that animals have that I have had now the opportunity to learn more about from an Indigenous perspective. So yeah, this is the book. And I just found out a few days ago that the hardcover has been sold out. And so that means now that they're releasing the soft cover on May 1st, which is great news because the hardcover is really expensive. So I'm really more excited about promoting it now that the soft cover is out and it's a reasonable price. And also it's more reasonable with the 20% off. So really thankful for that. So one of the main questions in my PhD dissertation is, and thinking about it, is that oftentimes when we think about settler colonialism in Canada, we often think of that state domination or the Canadian state bureaucratic control element. So we can think of the impacts of the Indian Act that's still in place today. We can think of the impacts of, and the negative impacts of residential schools. One of the things that some people don't know a lot about is the pass system. And the pass system was really common on the Prairie provinces. And so with the pass system, you needed a pass to get off the reserve. And so I've gone to the Glenbow Archives, which was in Calgary, and was looking at some of the passes from my own community, Red Pheasant. And I have this one example of a pass, and it's in the book from my own community. And this fellow wanted to leave the reserve to get horses. And so he had to go to the Indian agent and he had to ask for a pass. And the Indian agent would decide yes or no. And so if he got the pass, then he was allowed to leave the reserve. But if he didn't get the pass, it would be illegal for him to leave the reserve. So you could see how something like the pass system would really impact the economy of Indigenous communities. Dr. Sarah Carter wrote this really great book called Lost Harvests. And in that book, she talks about how there was a push when treaties were signed on the prairies, specifically for agriculture and in other places. But the pass system was also used to push down any sort of competition for selling produce. And so you can see elements like that impacting the economic system of Indigenous communities. And so those are all kind of bureaucratic control. And so then if we're answering that question, that, whoever controls, maybe that analogy, I have to get it right, but basically the purse strings and the purse. So whoever controls the money controls you. And so that idea that we have to become economically independent from the state, I wanted to think through that more in depth. And so we can think about treaty relationships. For example, I'm in Treaty 6. And how with treaty relationships, there is this ongoing treaty relationship where there should be that ongoing relationship. So that's one piece. But then when we're being pushed into economic development, oftentimes we have to think of how there is a certain sort of governance that can happen in the global economy and how that impacts Indigenous communities as well. And so one of the things I try to move through in the book a bit is how even with capitalism, the birth of capitalism on this land in Canada started with the fur trade and the Hudson Bay Company. And, Hudson Bay Company was one of the first corporations in the world. And how, I don't know if some of you might have heard of Harold Innis, and he was a political geographer, economist, and super interesting. And he talked about the Staples theory and how in the Staples theory, and he said this is something that Canada has had. We have with things like the fur trade. We have Britain, who was considered the core of the fur trade, where profits from furs were then invested in this core, and then that investment could leverage more money through their investment in doing different things. But then when we think of periphery, so Canada or as a colony, we can think of how Indigenous peoples would trade furs, and in exchange, they got different things. So they would get, flour, they would get sugar, they would get maybe lard. And so thinking about how they got different things, but Innis in a staple theory said the thing about the core is they're reinvesting those profits, and the shareholders are in Britain, and that they're getting the benefit of a certain economic path. But then the periphery, so Canada, then they're on a different staple dependency path. And so then, we can think of how now we can think of that Harold Innis's core and periphery in different ways. So maybe the core in certain spaces is Ontario, and the periphery is the Prairie provinces, for example. And so, it's not furs anymore. Maybe it's different staples like produce from agriculture. I live in Edmonton. And so, oil and gas industry is really big here. And so we can think of what Harold Innis said is then once one staple is you're done with it, then for the periphery, you're just looking for the next staple. So, in Alberta here, we're talking about maybe it's hydrogen is that next staple. But the interesting thing is, in terms of Indigenous perspective, oftentimes these resources are getting taken from Indigenous lands, but they're not the ones that are necessarily reinvesting those profits or getting the same equity of that. And so the two main arguments of my book, well, there's a few of them, but one is that there's kind of, we need to understand this settler colonialism through an economic lens and through this lens of economic exploitation, and starting with the creation of Canada. And so that's really important for us to understand that, but also that that when understanding settler colonialism, we also often just focus on that bureaucratic control, but we also need to think about economic exploitation and how that was really part and parcel and just as important, and is still super important to understand. And then there's the second argument I have of this double-edged sword. And so there's two kind of, when we're trying to think of, let's say, economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples, there's two kind of arguments that are often made, or actually they're not often made, but I want to make them. And so the first one is there's that exploitation, like in a Harold Innis way, where the profits are being reinvested, let's say, at the HBC. And so communities aren't leveraging the, let's say, the monies to invest it to have that same equity of what they're sharing. Now, this is changing in there are now these resource equity partnerships and that sort of thing. So that shift is happening. But there's another piece of the conversation that I hadn't read a lot about when we read about Indigenous economic development or Aboriginal economic development, and that is the philosophical belief systems of many Indigenous peoples on these lands, and how there can be this dissonance with some of the economic activities that happen. And so how do we think through that when we think of economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples? So this is for my PhD. And so I talked a lot about methodology and methods and how I gathered this information. And then I do a lot of outreach work. And so my friend Renee Beausoleil Macbeth and I were talking about this, and we thought this analogy of the tree helped to talk about methods and methodology. So from an Indigenous worldview, or ontology is how we say it in university, you can see the roots of the tree being the worldview and how that really grounds us. And then you can see that trunk of the tree, epistemology, being those Indigenous systems of knowledge that give the tree that strength. And then we can see the branches of the tree being a methodology of how we gather knowledge. And then all the different leaves could be different methods that we choose to use to gather that knowledge. And so for me in this book, I used Nehiyawak peoplehood methodology. And so Nehiyawak means Cree people. Peoplehood is draws from Thomas Home and others who talk about in settler colonial countries for Indigenous peoples. It's super important that we, as Indigenous peoples, continue to focus on 4 things. That means connection to our territory and land is really important. Connection to our language and learning and speaking our language. Connection to our living histories, so that storytelling piece, and ceremonial cycle. So, for example, now that it is spring, there's certain ceremonies that happen now that the snow's off the ground. And so within a calendar year, there's all these different ceremonies that happen. And so Home and others talk about, for Indigenous peoples in settler colonial contexts, we need to continue to focus on these 4 areas of being. And so for this book, I really wanted to connect with those 4 areas of Cree peoplehood and how I gathered the knowledge. And then I used, so I started with storytelling and oral histories, and I gathered 130 Cree stories. And so some of those stories were legends, some of those stories were historical accounts, some of those stories were funny stories, some of them were personal accounts, and I read through them over and over again. And then I used this software called In Vivo, and In Vivo is Latin, and it means from within the text itself. And so I used this methodology that's called grounded theory. And so the idea is you read through the text and you scan and highlight and code different concepts, and then doing that over and over in a repetitive way, you can come up with a theory that's ground up. And so these were some of the elements that I coded in terms of harvesting, relationships, transportation systems, protocols, governance, hunting, different principles. This is just one example of that. And then I would input, so these are some examples of some of the different stories that were related to generosity. And so an example, there were 11 families, and everything they had was in the loads on their backs, for they had killed and eaten their horses. This was a time of starvation, but they had buffalo meat, and they fed us grease and dried meat. When we had eaten, they wanted to go on, though my father asked them to camp with us by the river at the old Sundance place. We gave them tobacco and tea, and they gave us meat. So there was a trading. But the next day they crossed the river. We were sorry to see them go. So that's just one example of some of the stories that spoke to generosity and what that meant in these stories. So then I'm a real visual person. And so then it's interesting because then after you're done this process, it spouts out all these different relationships that these different elements have with each other. And so that was super helpful for me to start thinking about it. And then after that point, then I also started thinking about one of the main things that came out in this book is talking about Cree economic and governing relationships, and how the practices that happen in that are a bit nuanced in whether you're establishing a new relationship with, let's say, a Cree community or a Cree person. If you're, let's say, for example, traditionally, tobacco was seen as the first gift from Kichi-Manitou Kinnikinnick, so like natural tobaccos, not with all the additives that we have today, but that often times still is important, especially with elders and ceremonial people, in establishing that relationship. And then there's other protocols and practices when you're maintaining relationships, and then also other protocols and practices if you're having an opposing relationship with someone, and how to kind of have that diplomacy, and then moving towards restoring sometimes those opposing relationships, and how gift giving, for example, would be part of that restoration. The other thing that I found really interesting through this process is that the different types of oral stories that I worked with had to do with Cree people, with other Cree people within families or communities, Cree people with other Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, Cree people with animals and plants and other things in the world, and Cree people with spirit beings. And one time I asked my uncle, Nochawis, my little dad, Winston Wuttunee, and I asked him, "Uncle, what does self-determination mean? How do you say self-determination in the Cree language?" And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, "Niejhiawaski." And I said, "Oh, okay, Nehiyawak." And he said, that means Nehiyaw is a Cree person, and our Nehiyawak Cree people, and that's based on the word Neho, which is the word for four. And he said, we're the four-spirited people, and Aski means land. So self-determination for him meant the four-spirited people who have relationships and roles and responsibilities to those to the animal kingdom, to the spiritual, to the land, and to each other. And so that idea of what that self-determination means is related to that miyo pimâtisiwin, the good life. And how are we able to live our roles and responsibilities out with all of those relationships that we hold as important? So then after I started with the gathering the knowledge from the stories, I then went to Cree knowledge holders. And I took what I had found from the stories and from doing that process with NVivo, and I asked Cree knowledge holders in Treaty 6 in Alberta and Saskatchewan, about 14 of them, evenly distributed from Alberta and Saskatchewan, for their feedback, guidance, and examples of how and if these principles guide Cree economic relationships historically and today. I also asked guidance for what cultural or ceremonial knowledge could be shared within this work. And then for this, I had asked for people to share people in my network to tell me other knowledge holders that would be able to provide information and would want to be part of this project. And yeah. So out of this came this pimâtisiwin, so livelihood economy conceptual framework. And so within a livelihood model, all elements are interconnected and interdependent. And within a livelihood economy, all elements need to be considered and valued. So the center of this wild rose flower is the pistil and stamen, and it includes spirit beings, those relationships with spirit beings, land, water, air beings, each Indigenous people, and non-Indigenous peoples. So all of that within that pistil and stamen. And then the 5 petals, Métis Elder Elmer Ghostkeeper has talked about 4 aspects of any society: the economic, the cultural, the social, and the political. And I've done some work in partnership with different Indigenous legal orders, and so thinking about that as well today. So the petals represent those 5 aspects of any society, and then the leaves, the 4 leaves, represent what Tom Holm talked about, the peoplehood model, how we have to focus on those interlocking aspects of peoplehood, that connection to land and territory, those connections to living histories, the ceremonial cycle, and Indigenous languages. And the other thing is, just kind of as an embodied practice, my grandmother, Lillian Wuttunee, was a beater. And so Lillian, I got the opportunity to live with her when I was in high school, and I would watch her bead, but I never asked to learn. And then she's passed away now for 20 years, but I still have some of her beads. And so I beaded this. I'm just a beginner learning, but I beaded this using some of her beads from the 70s and 80s. And this hide is traditionally home tanned hide that we made in a course project partnered with a Assiniboine Nation. And so that was also a part of this as an embodied practice. The other thing, one of my coworkers, Tracy Howlett, is a cartographer. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when thinking, I also, used archives and looked historically at these things and oral histories. And for my generation of Cree people, we kind of only known, and my mom's generation, my grandfather was born in 1892, so starting in his generation, and we've only known the reserve system. So that's when we think of governance and land and territory, that's often what we think of is, for example, Red Pheasant First Nation. But when you look back before the reserve system, there was complex systems of governance and jurisdiction over lands that happened. And so this is a map of Treaty 6 using some of those historic governance concepts of Indigenous peoples. So we're from on my mom's side, the Wuttunee family, we're from the Eagle Hills area, which is outside of Battleford, the Battlefords. And we were called the River Cree, this is just one branch of Plains Cree people. And then if you go further west, we have the House Cree, and further west from that, the Parklands Cree. And where I live now is Amiskwachee Musconahigh again, Beaver Hills. And so we have this area, which was the Beaver Hills Cree. And so, there are other people groups at the time, but the branch of people that I was looking at for this study, this is where they were historically located before the reserve system happened. And so when Fine Day was a warrior chief. And in the 1930s, David Mandelbaum came up from the US and interviewed some different Cree leaders, and he interviewed Fine Day, and he asked Fine Day to draw a picture of a Plains Cree camp. And so Fine Day drew this picture of a Plains Cree camp in 1870. This is when this camp happened. And so it kind of shows a aerial view of some of the governance of this Plains Cree camp. So as the slide before, we have the river people, and I think that says, well, I don't know, it's pretty small. It could be 500, it could be 800 teepees, but we could think in a teepee, there could be 10 people of a family. So, that's 5,000 or 8,000 people of the river people that are gathered at this function. That would happen in the summer. We would come together. We have the Prairie people, we have the West people, and we have the House people. And so in the center, there's those 4 circles, the Cold Society, the Rattlers, the Big Dog Society, and the Buffalo Dancers. And they provided the policing function for each of their regional groupings when they came together. So the Big Dog Society was the policing function for the river people. And so they were camped kind of across kitty corner from where the river people camped. The other really cool thing is then you have the chiefs of the 4 communities where their Big Bear is there, and where his teepee was, Sweetgrass is there, and where his teepee was. And then you have the head Ogama. And so for this one example, at this Cree camp, there was Sweetgrass was said to be the head Ogama leader for this encampment. And so one of the things, as having a PhD in political science, that was really cool to me is how, pre-Treaty 6, before that, we had these really complex systems of governance that are still happening. These encampments still happen in the summer in Plains Cree territory. And we also had nestled levels of governance. So, we had our regional societies and the governance of that, governance at that family level, at the regional level. And then when we all came together, there was also systems of governance as well. Another thing that I did some research on is the international trade language that was really common on the plains in Canada and the US. And so this sign language, this Indigenous sign language, is still known today. People still can speak it. And this is an example of trade. And so there's all these, it's really interesting when you go to the archives. And one of the books I remember reading at the Glenbow in 2010 was talking about how there was that a lot of our highways, like Highway 2 from Edmonton to Calgary, and then it goes south, I think it's Browning, Montana eventually. But anyway, that those highways are based on Indigenous trail systems and trade systems. And so, so there's all these huge networks, either through the waterways and where our highways are now, where for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples traded. And in my book, I talk about this one story where I found in the archives these accounts from coming from Alberta, and a man and his family traveled 18 moons down to Mexico, which wasn't Mexico at the time, called Mexico, and then traded items and ceremonies, and then came back up. And so it talks about those different routes and stuff. And so, I think it's really cool to understand that when we see the worlds we live in today, even though it doesn't look like that history is there, we just have to dig around a little bit and understand there is that rich history that Canadian society is built on that we often have to unpack and really talk about more.
Shalene, just a little time check. We're at about 30 minutes now. So,
oh, perfect. Yeah. Okay. So another concept that I talk about is colonial dissonance. And that's kind of just this idea, you've probably heard of cognitive dissonance. And so it's just this idea of how because of colonialism, Indigenous peoples often have these ruptures in our relationships, creating tensions, internal conflict, instability, discord, mistrust between colonizers and settlers and Indigenous peoples. And that for some of us, especially that second part of the question of these philosophies we have about relating to all other living beings, and then living in a society where we can't necessarily uphold those relationships, it creates this colonial dissonance for us. And one of my students talks about how settlers also in these lands can also have sort of this dissonance as well impact them. And so then I have these different relationships, economic relationships, these principles that came out of the work. And so I go through them and give examples. And the cool thing about principles is that you can talk about it historically of how these principles were important, but they can still be applied today as well. So throughout the stories, I heard the principle of Cree society adapting, learning new things, trading for new items or technologies, exchanging medicines and ceremonies with others. Under this principle, certain protocols guide how new information is gathered and from where. And then I just talk about different practices like the giveaway and different types of giveaways, and a land-based course where we made tanned hide with a community and got students involved in that and how that relates to these grounding practices. And then Indigenous cooperative in Meadow Lake. And yeah, Iksi, that's all.
I clicked the wrong button. Try to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Shalene. This is such a very interesting presentation. So let's explore some of the ideas a bit more in relation to our work and the experience here at the NFU. And I know you've just kind of scratched the surface of what you wrote about in your book. I think the work that you've done to understand and communicate Cree economics has opened up some very powerful and interesting possibilities for changing how we think about economics. So we're just emerging from this social and economic disruption from the pandemic. And as a result of that, we have experienced an increased amount of separation and isolation. And with people moving to online work, there have been fewer in-person gatherings, and that kind of combined with maybe some of the negative effects of social media, it's really affected our political life and our culture. And you talk about separation as a key strategy of colonization. And I was wondering if the concept of Wahkohtowin, the Cree concept of Wahkohtowin, would that assist us in recovering from these negative social and political effects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, when we think of a concept like Wahkohtowin, we can think it in different layers. So at one layer, if you looked in a dictionary, it could mean kinship relationships. So relationships with families and extended family. We can also think of Wahkohtowin, and the late Dr. Harold Cardinal talked about Wahkohtowin as the governance of all relationships. And so we can think of kind of these core concepts that are these huge concepts and how they have all these sub-concepts or philosophies or principles underneath them. And so a concept like Wahkohtowin can talk about the way that we're to relate to each other in a family unit and more extensively, broader in relationship to our world. And so those principles I definitely think are super helpful. And there's a book called Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, and it was interviews with different elders in Saskatchewan, and it was edited by Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrandt. And in that, they also talk about how when treaties were negotiated, there is this sense in some ways of thinking about treaties from Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan perspective, where the idea from an Indigenous worldview, ontology, those roots of the tree, was to bring in settler society as extended kin. And so that idea of Wahkohtowin is really this spirit of generosity of bringing in settlers into the family of Indigenous peoples on these lands. And we all have different roles and responsibilities to uphold Wahkohtowin in that relationship. But I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about what now we call reconciliation.
Yeah, thanks. And another key economic process or central value that you discussed and explained is reciprocity. And I thought this was a real contrast with the capitalist economic system's focus on accumulation and growth. And as the NFU, we're trying to figure out how we can reduce agriculture's impact on climate. And more, it seems that to do that, we need to confront growth. And I'm wondering if some of the concepts that you've shared in your book and in your talk today can move us towards an economy that's less focused on growth and accumulation and maybe more on reciprocity.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I definitely think, yeah, when thinking about economic systems, one of the things that Dr. Shiva talks about is how there's always multiple economies at work. So we could just, think of what we learn in elementary and junior high about the economic systems of different nation states. And we could think of that as our economy, but we could also have this lens of thinking about economy in a broader way. So for example, if we think of the economy as pimâtisiwin, as livelihood, then we can think of the livelihood of different animals. We can think of nature's economy. We can think of, the capitalist economic system we're in today, but all of these economies that are at play, and our family's economy. And so I think that opens us up to, because one of the things we can think of when we're talking about global economic systems, it could almost seem a bit helpless that as individuals and as communities, that who are we to make these big changes. But if we think of economic systems as a multiplicity of economies that are happening, always, happening around us, then that can give us a bit more agency in the work that we're doing to see how we as a family or a community or your organizations that you're a part of can be a part of something different. And I think that's a really exciting place.
Yeah. So another point that you really made in your talk today is the way relationships are the focus of exchange, like to create, to maintain, to repair relationships, or to engage in oppositional relationships, including non-Cree people and other beings and the land. And you said you explore how our relationships with the land are constitutive. They create and co-create who we are as individuals and who we are as peoples. And I think this would really resonate with farmers who are developing ways of farming based on things like regenerative agriculture and agroecology and trying to practice food sovereignty. Do you think this offers some potential for reciprocity and solidarity between Indigenous people and farmers as we're working towards decolonization?
Yeah, for sure. And I think we could think of solidarity as a new thing or something to come towards. And then, I think of my grandpa, Gilbert Wuttunee, who was born in 1892 and went to Battleford Industrial School, residential school. And he wrote my mom, I have his words in my book. And in 1970, my mom recorded him. I never met him. He passed before I was alive, but he talked about a time in the Battlefords back when settlers first came, where there was this mutual respect and mutual relationality between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And him being from the Battlefords, he used that as an example. And he talked about all the different ways that reciprocity was enacted. And then he said at the end of that it's something shifted in that. And as a as a theorist, I can give some examples of what might have shifted in terms of the colonial project, but we can think of those early relationships as also something to return to, and how even you inviting me here today and being interested in reading this book, it shows that there's something Indigenous knowledges of living on this land that Indigenous peoples have had for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, that would be really maybe helpful and instructive. And now in this time of society, non-Indigenous people are getting interested in having those learnings, and maybe that cognitive dissonance or that colonial dissonance of some of the impacts of neoliberalism, that type of capitalism that's profits at all cost and growth at all costs, some of the limits of that, and wanting to look at alternatives. So I think this is a really exciting time.
Great. Well, thanks so much for this conversation, Dr. Jobin.